The weight of promises. By the time Jenny realized the truth, the rain had already soaked through her coat, plastering her dark hair against her pale face. She stood outside the cough, peering through the fogged-up window, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, her husband, Robert, sat across from a woman she didn't recognize. Their hands were intertwined on the table, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a way that Jenny knew too well: intimate, tender, deliberate. The sight was a knife twisting in her chest, sharper than anything she'd ever felt. 12 years of marriage, 2 children, countless whispered promises, all of it unraveling in the soft glow of a stranger's smile. She didn't scream. She didn't barge in. Instead, she turned and walked away, the rain masking the tears that streamed down her face. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. But then again, Jenny had always been good at fooling herself into believing things would turn out right. Jenny met Robert when she was 22, a wide-eyed art student with dreams bigger than her small hometown could hold. He was 25, a carpenter with rough hands and a quiet charm that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't before. They met by chance at a local fair, her sketching the Ferris wheel, him carrying a wooden chair he'd crafted for the auction. She'd caught him staring at her sketchbook, and when he'd smiled, it was like the sun breaking through a storm. "Beautiful," he'd said, nodding at her drawing. She'd blushed, assuming he meant the artwork, but his eyes never left her face. Their courtship was slow, deliberate. Robert wasn't one for grand gestures. He showed his love in small, steady ways, affixing her rickety easel, bringing her coffee when she pulled all-nighters, listening to her ramble about color theory and light. Jenny fell for him not in a rush, but in a quiet, inevitable drift, like a river carving its path through stone. They married 3 years later in a modest ceremony by the lake, surrounded by wildflowers and a handful of loved ones. She wore a simple white dress, he wore a suit that didn't quite fit his broad shoulders. They vowed to love each other through everything: sickness, health, joy, sorrow. Jenny believed every word. She had no reason not to. The early years were golden, even when they weren't easy. Robert's carpentry business took off slowly, and Jenny juggled her painting with odd jobs: waitressing, tutoring, anything to keep them afloat. Their first apartment was a cramped one-bedroom with peeling paint and a leaky faucet, but it felt like a palace because they were in it together. They'd laugh over burnt dinners, dance to scratched records in the living room, and fall asleep tangled in each other's arms, dreaming of a future they'd build brick by brick. Their daughter, Lily, arrived 2 years into the marriage, a tiny bundle with Robert's hazel eyes and Jenny's stubborn chin. 2 years later came their son, Ethan, a quiet boy who'd rather watch the world than conquer it. Parenthood stretched them thin: sleepless nights, endless diapers, the constant hum of worry, but it also bound them closer. Jenny would catch Robert rocking Lily to sleep, his deep voice murmuring lullabies, and her heart would swell. This was love, she thought. Not perfect, but real. They bought a house when Lily was 5, a fixer-upper with a sagging porch and a yard full of weeds. Robert spent weekends sanding floors and patching walls, while Jenny painted murals in the kids' room: stars for Lily, forests for Ethan. They were a team, a unit, a little universe of their own making. Jenny would look at her family and think, this is enough. This is everything. The trouble didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, like damp seeping into wood, unnoticed until the damage was done. Robert's business grew, and with it came longer hours. He'd come home late, smelling of sawdust and exhaustion, his smiles rarer than they used to be. Jenny noticed, but she didn't push. He was providing for them, she told herself. He was tired. She could carry the weight for both of them. She threw herself into her art, finally selling a few pieces at local galleries. It wasn't much, but it gave her a spark of pride, a sense of self beyond being a wife and mother. Robert would nod when she showed him her work, mutter something about it being nice, but his eyes were always elsewhere: on his phone, on the bills, on some distant horizon she couldn't reach. The arguments started small. He'd snap about the mess in the kitchen, she'd bite back about his late nights. They'd apologize, make up, but the silences grew longer, heavier. Jenny began to feel like a ghost in her own home, drifting through routines while Robert slipped further away. She'd lie awake at night, listening to his steady breathing, wondering when he'd stopped reaching for her in the dark. The woman in the cough. It was a Tuesday when Jenny saw them. She'd been downtown to drop off a painting for a client, a rare day without the kids: Lily at school, Ethan at a friend's. She'd decided to treat herself to coffee, a small rebellion against the monotony of her life. That's when she saw Robert's truck parked outside the cough, the one with the dented fender she'd teased him about fixing. Curiosity tugged at her. He'd said he was meeting a client about a custom order, so why not say hello? She crossed the street, the rain starting to fall in soft, cold drops. And then she saw him through the window, saw her, the woman with auburn hair, and a laugh that carried even through the glass. Jenny froze, her mind scrambling to make sense of it. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was the client. But then Robert leaned forward, his hand finding hers, and Jenny's world tilted. She didn't know how long she stood there, rain soaking her shoes, her heart hammering against her ribs. The woman said something, and Robert laughed, a sound Jenny hadn't heard from him in months. It was the laugh she'd fallen in love with, the one that used to light up their tiny apartment. Now it belonged to someone else. Jenny turned and walked back to her car, her legs trembling. She drove home in a daze, the wipers swishing against the windshield like a metronome to her grief. When she got inside, she sank onto the couch, staring at the mural she'd painted on the living room wall, a tree with branches stretching toward the ceiling, each leaf a memory of their life together. It felt like a lie now. Robert came home that night at his usual time, 7:30 p.m., his boots thudding against the mat as he shook off the rain. "Hey," he called, his voice casual, as if nothing had changed. "Kids in bed?" Jenny stood in the kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "How was your day?" "Fine. Busy. You know how it is." He shrugged off his jacket, avoiding her eyes. He always avoided her eyes these days. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand answers. But the words stuck in her throat, thick and choking. Instead, she nodded and turned back to the dishes, letting the silence swallow them both. For days, she said nothing. She watched him, his distracted glances at his phone, the way he lingered in the shower, the faint scent of perfume she couldn't place. She dug through his pockets one night, finding a receipt for a dinner she hadn't shared, a place they'd never been together. Each clue was a brick in the wall she was building around her heart, preparing for the collapse she knew was coming. It happened a week later. The kids were at her sister's for the night, a rare chance for Jenny and Robert to reconnect, or so she'd told herself. She'd cooked his favorite, roast chicken with rosemary, set the table with the good plates. He came home late again, his face drawn, and barely touched the food. "Robert," she said finally, her voice cutting through the clink of forks. "Who is she?" He froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "What?" "I saw you. At the cough. With her." The words spilled out, raw and jagged. "Don't lie to me." His shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she thought he'd deny it. But then he sighed, a sound so heavy it seemed to carry the weight of their entire marriage. "Her name's Claire," he said. She works at the hardware store. It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" Jenny's voice rose, trembling. "Because it looked like you were holding her hand. It looked like you were happy." "I don't know," he snapped, shoving his chair back. "I don't know what it is, okay? I needed something. Something you weren't giving me." The words hit her like a slap. "What wasn't I giving you? I've given you everything, my time, my love, our kids. What more do you want?" He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes wild. "I don't know. Maybe I just got tired of us. Tired of this." He gestured vaguely at the house, at her, at the life they'd built. Jenny stared at him, the man she'd loved for half her life, and felt a chasm open between them. "So you found someone else to fix it?" "It's not like that," he said, softer now, pleading. "It just happened. I didn't mean to hurt you." "But you did," she whispered. "You did." They didn't shout after that. They didn't fight. They just sat there, to strangers, in a house full of memories, the chicken growing cold on the table. Robert slept on the couch that night, and Jenny cried into her pillow until dawn. The next weeks were a blur of quiet devastation. They told the kids they were taking some time, a vague phrase that fooled no one. Lily asked why Daddy wasn't home some nights. Ethan just watched with those silent, knowing eyes. Jenny tried to keep it together for them, pasting on smiles she didn't feel, but inside she was crumbling. Robert moved out a month later, renting a small apartment near his workshop. He said he needed space, time to figure things out. Jenny let him go, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't hold on to someone who'd already left. She saw Claire once, by accident, at the grocery store. She was pretty younger than Jenny, with a brightness that made Jenny feel faded. Their eyes met across the aisle, and Claire looked away first, her cheeks flushing. Jenny wanted to hate her, but all she felt was exhaustion. Months passed, then a year. Jenny kept the house, kept painting, kept raising the kids. She found a rhythm in the wreckage, a fragile kind of peace. Robert came by sometimes, awkward visits to see Lily and Ethan, and each time, Jenny searched his face for the man she'd married. He was still there, buried under regret and distance, but she couldn't reach him anymore. One night, alone in her studio, she painted over the tree mural in the living room. She covered it with broad, angry strokes of blue, then softened it with whites and grays, a stormy sky, vast and unyielding. It was her story now, not theirs. She heard from a friend that Robert and Claire had broken up, that he was alone again. Part of her wanted to call, to see if there was anything left to salvage. But she didn't. Instead, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the stars, and let the weight of his betrayal settle into something she could carry. Jenny didn't know if she'd ever forgive him. She didn't know if she'd ever stop loving him. But she knew she'd survive this, one brushstroke at a time. The silence that followed the first months without Robert were a strange, hollow quiet. The house felt too big, its creaks and groans louder in his absence. Jenny would catch herself listening for the familiar thud of his boots, the jangle of his keys, only to remember he wasn't coming home. She'd turn off the porch light he used to nag her about leaving on, and the darkness would settle over her like a second skin. Lily and Ethan felt it too, though they showed it differently. Lily, now 8, became louder, her questions sharper. "Why doesn't Daddy live here anymore? Did we do something wrong?" she'd ask, her small fists clenched as if she could fight the truth away. Jenny would kneel beside her, smoothing her tangled hair, and say, "No, sweetheart. It's not about you. Sometimes grown-ups just need different things." The words tasted like ash, but they were all she had. Ethan, 6 and silent, withdrew into himself. He'd sit on the floor with his toy cars, lining them up in perfect rows, his brow furrowed like he was solving a puzzle no one else could see. Jenny worried about him most. His quiet was too deep, too heavy for a child. She'd try to draw him out, asking about school or his friends, but he'd just shrug, his hazel eyes so like Robert's darting away. She kept painting, though. It was the one thing that still made sense. Late at night, after the kids were asleep, she'd lose herself in her studio, a converted corner of the garage. The canvases grew darker, storm clouds, jagged cliffs, oceans swallowing the shore. She didn't sell these ones, they were too raw, too much a piece of her. But they kept her breathing. Robert called sometimes, his voice tinny through the phone. "How are the kids?" he'd ask, and Jenny would give him the barest updates: Lily's science project, Ethan's new shoes. She didn't ask about him, didn't want to know if he was happy or miserable or somewhere in between. But she could hear it in his pauses, the way his breath hitched before he said goodbye. Regret, maybe, or guilt. She didn't care enough to name it. He came by every other weekend to take the kids. Those visits were the hardest. Jenny would watch from the window as he loaded them into his truck, Lily chattering, Ethan clutching his backpack. Robert would glance at the house, his jaw tight, and for a moment, she'd wonder if he missed them. Then he'd drive off, and she'd be alone again with the ghosts of what used to be. One Saturday, he lingered after dropping them back. The kids ran inside, and Jenny stood on the porch, arms crossed, waiting for him to leave. But he didn't. He shifted his weight, hands in his pockets, and said, "Can we talk?" She wanted to say no, to shut the door and lock him out of her life for good. But something in his eyes, tired, pleading, made her nod. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she'd confronted him months ago, the air thick with unspoken words. "I messed up, Jen," he said, his voice low. "I know that. I don't know how to fix it." She stared at the grain of the wood, tracing its lines with her eyes. "You don't get to fix it, Robert. You broke it. You broke us." "I didn't mean to," he started, but she cut him off. Don't say you didn't mean it. You made a choice. Every time you met her, every time you lied to me, you chose her over us." Her voice cracked, but she held his gaze, refusing to look away. "Do you even know what that did to me? To the kids?" He flinched, his hands clenching into fists. "I was lost, okay? I felt like I was drowning here, same routine, same fights, same everything. Claire, she was something new. She didn't need me to be anything but what I was. And I did." Jenny's laugh was bitter, sharp. "I needed you to be my husband, the father of our children. Was that too much?" "No," he whispered. "It wasn't. I got weak." She leaned back, exhaustion washing over her. "Then why are you here, Robert? What do you want?" He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "I want to come back. I want my family." For a heartbeat, she almost said yes. The part of her that still loved him, the part that remembered dancing in the apartment, building this life, screamed to take him back, to try again. But then she thought of the cough, of Claire's hand in his, of the months she'd spent picking up the pieces he'd left behind. "No," she said, her voice steady. "You don't get to walk away, and then walk back and like nothing happened. We're not your safety net." He nodded slowly, like he'd expected it but hoped otherwise. "I'm sorry, Jen, for all of it." She didn't say anything as he stood and left. The door clicked shut, and she sat there, listening to the hum of the fridge, until the tears came again. Lily started acting out at school. Her teacher called one afternoon, voice gentle but firm. She pushed a boy on the playground today. Said he called her dad a quitter. She's angry, Jenny. Jenny drove to pick her up, her stomach churning. Lily sat in the principal's office, arms crossed, her face a mirror of Jenny's own stubbornness. "He deserved it," she muttered when Jenny asked what happened. "Sweetheart, you can't hurt people because you're mad," Jenny said, kneeling beside her. "Why not?" Lily's eyes blazed. "Daddy hurt us, and he's fine." Jenny pulled her into a hug, feeling the tremble in her small frame. "He's not fine, Lily. He's just better at hiding it. But we don't get to choose how other people feel. We just have to take care of ourselves." At home, she sat Lily down with a sketchbook. "Draw it," she said. "Whatever's in your head. Get it out." Lily hesitated, then started scribbling angry reds and blacks, a storm of lines. Jenny watched, her heart aching, knowing she couldn't erase her daughter's pain, only help her carry it. Ethan's struggles were quieter but no less deep. One night, Jenny found him sitting on the stairs, staring at a photo of the four of them from a camping trip years ago. His voice was small when he spoke. "Is Daddy ever coming back?" She sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "I don't know, buddy. But even if he doesn't live here, he still loves you. That doesn't go away." He nodded, but his eyes stayed on the photo, like he was trying to memorize a world that didn't exist anymore. Across town, Robert sat in his apartment, a one-bedroom with bare walls and a mattress on the floor. He'd ended things with Claire months ago, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't stand the man he saw in her eyes. She'd been a distraction, a fleeting escape, but she wasn't home. Home was the house with the sagging porch, the kids' laughter, Jenny's paint-stained hands. And he'd thrown it away. He worked late most nights now, losing himself in the rhythm of saws and sandpaper. His hands were still rough, but they felt empty without Jenny's to hold. He'd see her in everything: the curve of a chair he'd made for their dining room, the smell of rosemary in the air, the way the light hit the lake when he drove past it. She was everywhere, and he was nowhere. He tried to be a good father, showing up for Lily's soccer games, taking Ethan fishing. But the kids were different with him now, guarded, unsure. He'd catch Lily glaring at him sometimes, her anger a wall he couldn't climb. Ethan just watched him, waiting for something Robert didn't know how to give. One night, alone with a bottle of whiskey, he wrote Jenny a letter. It was messy, scrawled on a scrap of paper, but it poured out of him every regret, every apology, every hope he'd buried. He didn't send it. He couldn't. Instead, he tucked it into a drawer, a confession to no one but himself. A year turned into 2, and Jenny found her footing. She started teaching art classes at the community center, her days filled with paint-splattered kids and the hum of creativity. Her work began to sell, small pieces at first, then larger ones, her storms and shadows resonating with people she'd never met. She wasn't rich, but she was enough. The kids grew. Lily's anger softened into resilience, Ethan's silence into thoughtfulness. They still saw Robert, still loved him, but they were hers in a way they'd never been his. She built a new life around them, piece by piece, like a mosaic from broken glass. One spring evening, she sat on the porch with a canvas, painting the sunset pinks and oranges bleeding into the sky. Lily joined her, sketching beside her, and Ethan brought his cars, lining them up on the steps. The air was warm, the world soft, and for the first time in years, Jenny felt whole. She didn't know if Robert would ever find his way back to himself. She didn't know if she'd ever trust anyone the way she'd trusted him. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, she realized it didn't matter. She had her art, her children, her strength. And that was enough. 2 years after Robert moved out, Jenny's life had settled into a rhythm, not perfect, but steady. The house no longer echoed with his absence, it hummed with the chaos of Lily's soccer cleats and Ethan's toy cars, the clatter of her brushes against the easel. She'd carved out a space for herself, a fragile independence built on late-night painting and the small victories of single motherhood. But there were nights when the silence crept back in, when the bed felt too wide, and she'd wonder if this was all there'd ever be. It started with a man named Thomas. He was a regular at the community center where Jenny taught her art classes, a tall, weary guy with salt and pepper hair and a habit of lingering after sessions to ask about her techniques. He was a photographer, he told her once, his voice warm and unhurried. "I like capturing what people don't see," he'd said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. She'd smiled, unsure what to say, and turned back to cleaning her brushes. Thomas didn't push. He'd show up every Tuesday, his camera slung over his shoulder, joining the adults who fumbled with charcoal and acrylics under her guidance. He'd ask her opinion on his sketches' rough, earnest attempts at landscapes, and listen when she talked about light and shadow. There was no rush in him, no demand, just a quiet presence that began to feel familiar. One evening, after the class emptied out, he stayed behind to help her stack the chairs. The room smelled of paint and coffee, the windows dark with early autumn dusk. "You're good at this," he said, nodding at the easels. "Not just the art, the teaching. You make people feel like they can try." She laughed, a little self-conscious. "Most of them are just here to kill time." "Maybe," he said, his smile soft. "But you give them more than that." Her chest tightened, not unpleasantly, but with a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. She busied herself with the supplies, avoiding his gaze. "Thanks," she murmured, and he didn't press further. Weeks passed, and Thomas became a fixture, small conversations turning into longer ones, his quiet humor coaxing smiles from her she didn't expect. He'd tell her about his trips to the coast, the way the sea looked at dawn through his lens, and she'd find herself sharing bits of her own world, her kids, her paintings, the way she'd once dreamed of seeing Paris. It was easy, too easy, and that scared her. One night, as they locked up the center, he paused by the door. "Jenny," he said, his voice careful, "would you like to grab coffee sometime? Just us." The question hung there, simple but loaded. Her heart stuttered, a rush of warmth clashing with a colder, sharper fear. She thought of Robert, of his hands on hers, his promises, the way he'd turned away. She thought of the cough window, the rain, the betrayal that still lived in her bones. I don't know," she said, her voice smaller than she meant it to be. "It's not that I don't want to. It's just—" "You don't have to explain," he said quickly, his hands raised. "I get it. No pressure." But she shook her head, needing to say it. "It's not you. My husband, ex-husband, he. It's been a while, and I'm not sure I'm ready." Thomas nodded, his eyes steady. "I've got time. Whenever you're ready, or if you're never ready, that's okay too." He left with a wave, and Jenny stood there, the keys cold in her hand, wondering why her throat felt so tight. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her studio, staring at a half-finished canvas, a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, her back to the sea. It was her, she knew, teetering between falling and stepping back. Thomas's offer replayed in her mind, gentle but insistent, stirring something she'd buried deep. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to feel something new, something that wasn't tied to Robert's shadow. But every time she pictured sitting across from Thomas, laughing over coffee, her mind conjured Claire's face, Robert's hand in hers, the lie she'd lived without knowing. Trust was a fragile thing, and hers had shattered. Could she build it again? Did she even want to? The next morning, she called her sister, Mara, who'd always been the one to talk her off ledges. "He's nice," Jenny said, pacing the kitchen. "He's kind. But what if I'm just broken? What if I can't do this again?" "You're not broken," Mara said firmly. "You're hurt. There's a difference. And this guy, he's not asking you to marry him, Jen. It's coffee. 1 cup. You don't have to decide your whole future over a latte." Jenny laughed despite herself, the sound shaky. "I hate when you're right. Get used to it," Mara teased. "Go. See what happens. You deserve to feel something good." She said yes the next Tuesday, her voice barely audible over the thud of her pulse. Thomas grinned, a quiet triumph in his eyes, and they set a time Saturday morning, a little place downtown with mismatched mugs and a view of the park. When the day came, Jenny spent too long in front of the mirror, tugging at her sweater, brushing her hair, then messing it up again. Lily watched from the doorway, her head tilted. "You look pretty, Mom. Are you going on a date?" Jenny's stomach flipped. "Just coffee with a friend," she said, forcing a smile. "You and Ethan okay with Aunt Mara today?" "Yeah," Lily said, then hesitated. "Is he nice?" "Who?" "The friend." Her voice was small, protective. Jenny knelt, meeting her eyes. "Yeah, he is. But it's just coffee, okay? Nothing's changing." Lily nodded, satisfied, and Jenny hugged her tight, grateful for her daughter's fierce little heart. The coffee was warm when she arrived, the air thick with cinnamon and chatter. Thomas was already there, his camera on the table, a mug steaming in front of him. He stood when he saw her, his smile easy. "You made it." "Barely," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. "I almost talked myself out of it." "Glad you didn't," he said, and there was no judgment in it, just a quiet gladness that made her relax. They talked about his latest project, her classes, the way the leaves were turning gold outside. He didn't ask about Robert, didn't pry, and she was grateful for that. But as the minutes ticked by, she felt it a spark, faint but real, flickering in the space between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was possibility, and that was enough to terrify her. When they parted, he walked her to her car, the air crisp against her cheeks. "Can we do this again?" he asked, his hands in his pockets. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." Coffee turned into lunches, then a walk through the park where he showed her how to frame a shot with his camera. Each step was tentative, a dance of advance and retreat. Jenny would catch herself laughing at his dry jokes, or brushing his arm by accident, and pull back, startled by how natural it felt. She'd lie awake afterward, replaying moments, wrestling with the guilt that lingered not for Robert, but for letting herself want this. Thomas was patient. He'd wait for her to reach out, never pushing past her boundaries. Once, over dinner at a quiet Italian place, he told her about his own divorce 10 years ago, a slow drift rather than a betrayal. "It took me a while to stop feeling like I'd failed," he said, whirling his fork in his pasta. "But you figure it out. You keep going." She nodded, her throat tight. "I want to. I'm just scared." "Of what?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Of trusting someone again. Of it falling apart." He reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers, waiting. She took it, her fingers trembling, and he squeezed lightly. "We'll go slow," he said. "As slow as you need." Months passed, and Jenny found herself softening. Thomas became a part of her life, not a replacement for Robert, but something new, something hers. He met the kids one afternoon, bringing his camera to show Ethan how it worked, laughing when Lily demanded he take her picture mid-cartwheel. They liked him, she could tell, and that eased a knot in her chest she hadn't known was there. One night, as they sat on her porch watching the stars, he kissed her soft, hesitant, a question more than a claim. She kissed him back, her heart racing, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel Robert's ghost between them. It was just her, Thomas, and the quiet promise of something beginning. She didn't know if it would last. She didn't know if she'd ever fully heal. But as she leaned into him, the weight of the past felt lighter, and the future a little less like a cliff, a little more like a path.